we'll start with actually Christy's question, and then I will put the questions that we're going to ask today in the chat panel in a second. But how long are you spending on needs analysis? You know, and maybe we could even talk a little bit about the pay. You know, do you charge this to customers or not? So we'll start with Dani on this one. So Dani, your name, your company, and then the needs analysis.
Sure. I'm Dani Watkins. My company is Zenith Performance Solutions. And I do charge typically for that needs analysis, and there's a spectrum of needs analysis, right? There might be what Robert mentioned, a whiteboarding session where we're just gathering some requirements. A lot of times when a company doesn't know exactly what to do because they're not familiar with training, I very often will do a whiteboarding session or I will do a proposal, and and I do charge for it. And usually, on average, it'll take, you know, a total of about 10 to 15 hours on my part in gathering their requirements, talking to folks in their organization. But that's for like trying to determine what the e-learning should cover, or, I mean, I've done needs analysis projects that are more like, you know, several months where we do intense interviews and things like that. But typically it's more of a requirements gathering because they don't have a clue what they need. And so it's conversations of, you know, well, what are the major business issues you're seeing? And what Dennis mentioned is very often it turns into, I'm not sure that it's a training problem. I think it might be an organizational issue, or it might be, you know, some other issue. And quite frankly, if that's not my area of expertise, then I'm going to bring in somebody from my bench who has that area of expertise and be really honest that training is not the solution. I mean, we all know that everybody's like, oh, this person can't manage their time or they can't make it to work on time. We should train them. That's not going to fix the problem. It might be an accountability problem. So that's sort of how I approach it. And, you know, needs analysis, I think, can be all over the board. But most of the time, I can have some conversations, determine what the scope is going to be, and then give them some recommendations in a fairly short. And I almost always charge for it because I feel like that's some value that I'm really bringing to the table in my skill set. So, yeah.
Perfect. Thank you, Dani. All right, moving on to Dennis. Your name, your company, and the needs analysis. You know, how long does it take to generally charge for it?
Thanks, Patty. My name's Dennis Hall. I'm the founder of LearningTemplates.com, co-founder of AwesomeThemeDesigners.com. Essentially, in my learning development background, I've had almost every time where I've had to perform a needs analysis. I don't recall too many times that I've never performed one. And those have really varied in time. Sometimes you're going to have a very short needs analysis because the gap is obvious, the learning gap is obvious. And that's typically when there's something new introduced into the company, when it becomes obvious. So those ones are usually very short, especially if they're some sort of software upgrade training or something. Technical training, needs analysis, you tend to get a little more in depth because you, if you're developing training from scratch, you've typically within technical training got to go through a whole lot of purpose function fit of every single component of some technical thing. So you'll be a longer term. The longest term ones that I find are ones where you're training people, whether it be technical training, administrative, or even software, from various different groups. So everyone's perspective in what everyone's outcome as to what you need to be training on is different. So those ones take a long time because you're going to have to interview each audience type and establish what the gap is in every case. And then, as was mentioned earlier, there were cases where, for example, I did spend about 4 months doing a needs analysis for a company that I was working for at the time in the 911 industry, and the result of that one was no training required. Restructure your department, and the reason for it was supervisors were basically employees that were brought up through the ranks and not really provided any structure. to their job. So essentially, it was to create a middle manager that would basically train the supervisors and give them their rules to work by. So that was about it. That's all I've got to say.
Awesome. Thank you, Dennis. Very helpful. That's a very interesting analysis, and then they needed a restructure. My goodness. I would not have wanted to be the one to tell them that. Okay, moving on to Karen. Karen, your name, where you work, and then what do you think about needs analysis? About how long does it take, and is it generally paid or not?
Karen Lubrecht. I'm with CKC Consultants. I think the needs analysis is important if you can get in front of the right person to get in at that level of the project. The time varies drastically, and so, as I mentioned in the chat, I'll give a first-time customer an hour conversation over what they want to do and so on, just to make sure we're on the same page. It does go into, a formal one goes into my pricing. And it's important that on some level you provide one so that you know what the success looks like in their mind, and that if the project does not meet their standards for success, you have the documentation to point out the direction you felt the project should have gone. So if you're getting into the surveys and the questions and the details, as was just mentioned, it can take a long time to wire it down, but one way or another, it's important to make sure that you have the whole project defined and you know what they're expecting you to do, as Robert stated in his presentation, and that you have clarified to the best of your ability what really needs to be done.
Perfect. Thank you, Karen. Okay, and then last but certainly not least, Shannon, your name, your company, and needs analysis. How long does it take, and do you generally do paid or not?
Hi, Shannon Connor, Kick Learning. I think that we're all on the same page. It's interesting to listen to everyone. And I think also, speaking to what Robert talked about with trust, we have very good relationships with our clients. So if it's an existing client that you have a good relationship with, we're brought in and we have needs analysis discussions, and we know that that's going to be wrapped into the pricing for the project as a whole. So I think that's probably treated a little bit differently than a brand new customer client that you've not worked with before. And indeed, you should charge for the time. I do like what everyone's saying. I do the same. Having an hour call to just kind of scope it out and see if it's even a project you want to do a needs analysis for is important. So I don't even consider that free time. I figure that it's free, but it's valuable to me because maybe I'm realizing this is not someone I even want to work with. So that hour invested up front is very important. And then depending upon your relationship from there, it's an existing client, you build in the needs analysis on a project by project basis, or indeed you would charge for the analysis if it's a new client. I would certainly recommend that to build value. I talked to somebody recently who talked about subcontractors. She said, I wouldn't hire anybody under a certain pay rate. I just don't take them seriously. I don't think they're professional. So I think same thing. If you're not charging, you're not perceived as professional.
Yeah. Well, that's kind of what Robert found in his, Okay. Well, so perfect. Okay. Very, very helpful. And then the next question that we'll go into is, I think this is from Ant. He currently uses a scope of work document, but he also feels like he needs a legal contract. Should I have both? And we kind of talked about both of them today, and maybe there's no exact way that it should be, but just to get everybody's opinion on it. I'm going to start with Dennis on this one. So do you generally do a scope of work and a contract, or do you do a mix of both, or how do you do that?
Yeah, thanks, Patty. If a legally binding contract's required, typically the client's going to be the one to give that to you, along with they may also provide a non-disclosure agreement or an NDA. I myself would not trigger giving a client a contract at the onset, and that's because sometimes that scares them too. This can come off as, oh, geez, you're way too formal for what we're trying to achieve, that sort of thing. So it could give some bad feedback to the client in that sense. However, when it comes to it, if a contract is required and the customer has requested one, yes, I'll give them one. Sometimes, for example, some government industries as well as large industries will require that you be like an LLC in Europe, for example, a limited liability company, or here incorporated here. Sometimes they'll want that. In those cases, usually you're going to have to provide a contract as well as proof that you're incorporated and such. Beyond that, if nobody ever asks for a contract, I'm going to definitely always provide a statement of work. And that statement of work is going to identify the specific deliverables, the dates they're delivered, what file types are being delivered to them. And earlier I'd seen somebody was talking about software being used. So for example, if I have to purchase software to complete a contract for a client, I'm going to include that purchase of the software in the statement of work as well. I'm then going to also add value to that by also including training for them on the software in the project that I've created for them. So this is another income thread into the project. And if they don't want it, then they're just going to at the statement of work level, they're going to say, we don't want that, or we do. And this is where most of the negotiations actually happen in my case. There was also, are there examples and stuff? Yeah, there's many examples. If you just do a Google search for them, you're going to see all kinds of templates out there and such that are free, some that you pay for. And what I've discovered is over the years that all of those have never really worked for me, so I've come up with my own in every case. And then again, resources related would be a Google search. Again, in every case, I've found that my own versions of these have worked out the best. That's all I've got to say.
Thank you very much, Dennis. Yeah, so it sounds like statement of work always, and then a contract when it's asked for. Yeah, we'll kind of combine a couple of questions. I like Dennis answer that. It kind of combined a couple. So we'll move on to Karen, and let's talk about do you use a scope of work and also a contract, or both, one or the other? And then also, if you do use a contract, do you provide it, or does the company usually provide it?
The contract with larger corporations is usually provided by the corporation, in which case you want to have a lawyer look over the document. You want to make sure that it provides for ownership of any work that you do. And if not ownership, are you allowed to adapt it and use it as a sample, especially if you're in a proprietary field? There's difficulties getting some of the financial or information out to be used later on. With respect to smaller organizations, I like at least a letter of agreement or a letter of intent to cover. I find that is a little bit easier to get through to people, that it is not, I'm not an outsider that has no concept of the fact that you can work with a handshake. I've worked with handshakes on things in the past and have done it twice, won't do it again. The clarification is always an issue. You need to have that formal document so that they take you as a valid and reliable source. Gives you the credibility. I also want a statement of work that is very detailed, provides the documents need to be supplied in order to extend the scope of the work, includes ownership, who's going to do what, whose responsibilities, where, what our timeline is, what our payments are. And so I find that all of that falls into the scope of work. That so is so much easier. The SOW is so much easier to deal with and have them be able to go through almost as a checklist. it's sometimes a bit of a challenge with some groups to have them understand that this is important, and it's to their mutual benefit. They have in writing what they expect from you. And if you can put it on that side, not only do you know what they want and are clear on what they are looking for, but they know what to expect from you as well. And I think that's about it.
Perfect.
Googling for the documents, and I've adapted mine through the years. And there are a lot of great resources out there for the initial. There's actually one that gives you the steps for the SOW, what they would like to see included in it.
Yeah, and we've also included or added, shared some of our own statement of work on Slack. So if you are on Slack and would like, you have a statement of work template or something like that you'd like to share, I know it would be greatly appreciated. So people can kind of make their own out of the templates. So that's very helpful.
Right. And Robert mentioned Peter's book, which is incredible. It is a resource that everybody needs, whether you consider yourself a consultant or not. I think he's come out with newer editions. My second, I think there's now a third edition out. And it's a fantastic resource with a lot of checklists that can really facilitate the process for you.
And you're talking about the book that Robert mentioned?
You're right, Flawless Consulting.
Yeah, perfect.
I can put the information in the chat.
That would be incredible. Thank you very much.
Okay.
All right. And then moving on to Shannon, kind of combining the questions. Do you do a scope of work and a contract and then does it come from you or from the client? How does that work generally?
Yeah, I think this evolves as you work more and more in the industry. When I started out as an independent contractor and took whatever I could get, I signed whatever contract was put in front of me, and it is always usually offered by the client. When I started breaking out and becoming more successful and formed my company, I did the Google route, pulled down some documents. It was all right. And eventually, though, I hired an attorney. And first I hired an attorney that was close to me geographically but didn't understand the business. And she was a labor attorney, which was okay. But I ended up finding one through Google searches that specialized in technology and software and app development types of projects. And that was great, very beneficial. So here's what we do, what I do. When a client wants to engage me or Kick Learning on a project, I provide an estimate. In the estimate, of course, it has your general understanding of what the project is, and it also has a list of assumptions, which is very important to outline up front. And there's a signing block on the bottom of that page. And so that goes to them, and that's our first step. And it just kind of clarifies. And there's been times when the client might say, oh, there might be a little bit of lack of understanding here. Let's talk about this. This is a little bit different. So we do a lot of tweaking based on that estimate right from the beginning. And then when you're very clear, then the contract is created. And yes, typically, especially if you're working with a large client, that is done by the client. Usually they have their own in-house legal team that does it. And with all of my clients, they attach that original estimate that I provided. They've signed it, and it has a list of the assumptions, so it becomes an addendum to the contract. So that's worked very well. Now, when you also become an approved vendor for large companies, then you'll work under probably a master services agreement. Is it okay, Patty, if I go ahead into that a little bit?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Do.
Okay, so I don't have a whole lot to say, but just that this makes it a whole lot easier. I had one client, a nonprofit organization, that every project, even though it was almost identical to the last project, we had to go through a whole legal review, and finally they got it together and said, all right, we're going to do a master level agreement, and then that's good for a year. Each year we revisit it, make sure the pricing is correct, in terms of rates, etc. But for each project, it's just a one-page statement of work, or it could be a few more pages, but usually it's about 1-2 pages. And that outlines the specifics of the actual project. So by that stage, you've already got quite a few things going on. You've got your original estimate that you've already come to agreement on. You've got your master level agreement, and then you've got your statements of work. And so Ant was saying, geez, that's a lot to ask for up front, but I think it's not all up front. As you go through the process, all of this falls into place. And it gets easier the more you work with one client over and over again.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Sure.
I like how you float us through the process. That's very helpful. Okay, and then last but not least is Dani. This will be our last question of the day, unless somebody puts something in chat, because we're getting about 5 minutes up to the hour. But Dani, do you do a scope of work? Do you do a contract? Do you do one or the other? And do you generally provide it, or does the client provide it?
Yeah, my process is very similar to Shannon's, and I would agree with most of everything she said. Definitely when I started, I did the whole Google search, found some samples out there, and then I like to start from something. I also found when I first started, Rocket Lawyer was really helpful for me and was worth I think you can do a couple for free, and then that gave me some structure around it. And then over time, I think from peers, you sort of can identify pieces and parts of contracts that you like. So my process, though, is similar to Shannon's. I typically will give them a proposal. It's usually a few pages. It includes commitments. It includes some commitments on both sides. So this is what I'm committing to. This is what they're committing to in terms of deliverables. And then I usually have assumptions in there. I've got the pricing in there, and then I've got timeline. I usually, in contrast to what Dennis said, I usually don't put dates in there yet. I usually will say that this timeline is for the first quarter of 2016, and that a timeline will be established once the project is kicked off. I usually have that sort of information. And then if we sort of negotiate that, make sure that everybody's good with what's in that document. It's usually, 4 pages. Typically, it'll also include my estimation tool that I've estimated the project, so they can see exactly what they're going to receive in terms of the e-learning. So is there audio, no audio, those kinds of things. And then if it's approved, then I do a statement of work that just highlights those items, and they sign off on that. It also has my payment terms in there, and my statement of work as well is 1 or 2 pages. If it's a client I work with all the time, like we have clients that we've been clients with for several years, I just give them a statement of work, and I too am usually under a master services agreement with their organization. So every time a new project comes up, I just give them a new statement of work. It has the commitments, it has the assumptions, it has the pricing, payment terms, and then a place for them to sign, honestly. The other contracts that I don't think anyone mentioned today is I also have contracts with my subcontractors. And so that's another really important piece that I think needs to be mentioned. And so anybody who comes to subcontract with us, they sign a contract that has the non-disclosure in there, has some non-compete information in there, has in Colorado, they're really cracking down on subcontractors, and so I have to be, I have some language in there that I, they're very clear that they're responsible for their own taxes. They're responsible. There's 5 questions that the state of Colorado asks to determine if someone should be a 1099 or an employee, and so I make sure that that's clearly stated in my partner. I call my contractors partners in my partner agreements. And then I'm trying to think, usually a welcome letter, and then I have a project details document that is one document that just details the project, what software they need, what the project is, and how much the pay rate is, because sometimes with the subcontractor, depending on the project, the pay rate might be different based on what I'm getting paid for that project. So I think there's 2 buckets. You have your proposal and statement of works for your client, and then you also, if you're going to use subcontractors, you need to have some things in place for them. I am a paperless person, so I do it all through Right Signature is the tool I use for online signatures for those documents, and Adobe Echo is another one. I chose Right Signature because we use Citrix ShareFile, and they come as a package. So that was a quick 4 minutes, 3 minutes, but that's sort of what we do and what works, but really similar to what Shannon mentioned. So.
Perfect. That is actually very, very helpful, Dani, with the subcontractors, and I will take a special note, since I am in Colorado as well, about that. and I may be reaching out to you for some questions.
Yeah. Watch out for that state of Colorado. They're cracking down hard. And I've actually gotten the phone calls as a contractor asking me those questions. So I've been on the receiving end of those. And then as I got those, I said, I need to put something in here so that my contractors are in the, a very clear place of what their role is. So
right.
Good stuff.
Okay. Good to know. Awesome. Okay. Well, we are at the top of the hour, so I will just go ahead and a couple of quick things. Make sure to sign up to be a part of the panel. There's a few spots left. I outlined them in the meeting reminder yesterday. You can also sign up on Slack, and you have the link there. It's all fun and games until we all just show up and nobody's on the panel. So make sure to do that. We've got a few spots left. Submit questions next week. We are meeting on January 28th, same time, same place. Learning analysis as a service. So if you have questions about learning analysis, submit questions on Slack or reply to me. Make sure to invite folks to come. I put the invitation URL where they can register in the chat. I'll also send it out in the announcement tomorrow with the recorded video. So great to see everybody. Have a wonderful week. Be well. Bye.
Hi, everyone. Have a great week.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.
See you guys.
Yeah.